ADD.
Introduction, meaning and nature of interpretation. Introduction. Enacted laws, especially the modern acts and rules, are drafted by legal experts, and it could be expected that language used to leave little room for interpretation or construction. But the experience of all those who have to bear and share the task of application of the law has been different. So, enacted laws. Laws are basically enacted by legislative body of the country, especially modern acts and rules are drafted by the legal experts, and it could be expected that this is the introduction of this article. Okay, and the task of main judiciary is to introduction, meaning and nature of interpretation. So, enacted laws, especially the modern acts and rules, are drafted by legal experts, and it could be expected that the language used to leave little room for interpretation and construction. So, basically, we all know that laws are enacted by the legislative body of the country. In the case of India, it is the parliament and the state legislature. But the experience of all those who have to bear and share the task of application. The task of application here, it is referring to the judiciary of India. Application of the law has been different. So the main task or main function of the judiciary is the interpretation of statutes. By interpretation of statutes means ascertaining the meaning of the statute or ascertaining the intention of the legislature. Interpretation means the art of finding out the true sense of an enactment by giving the words of the enactment their natural and ordinary meaning. It is the process of ascertaining the true meaning of the words used in the statute. Generally, there are three types of interpretation. Number one, literal interpretation. Number two, mischief rule. And number three, golden rules of interpretation of statutes. Generally, there are three. First of all, they prefer to give it meaning through literal rules of interpretations. The literal rules of interpretation gives the judges very little room or little scope of using their creativity. But the one thing is to be noted here is that the judges, while interpreting the statutes, cannot interpret those statutes arbitrarily. They must have to guided by certain rules of interpretation. Interpretation means the art of finding out the true sense of an enactment by giving the words of the enactment their natural and ordinary meaning. It is the process of ascertaining the true meaning of the words used in a statute. The court is not expected to interpret arbitrarily, and therefore there have been certain principles that have evolved out of continuous exercise by the courts. These principles are sometimes called rules of interpretations. So these are the principles which the court have to follow while interpreting an statute or an enactment. The object of interpretation of statutes is to determine the intention of the legislatures conveyed. The intention of the legislatures are conveyed in the statute or the enactment. It may be conveyed expressly or may be impliedly. And also, of course, in the language used. As stated by Salmon, these lines are under quotation. By interpretation or construction is meant the process by which the court seeks to ascertain the meaning of the legislatures through the medium of authoritative forms in which it is expressed. Medium of authoritative forms means enactment or legislatures. It means statutes in which it is expressed. Of course, the intention of the legislature is expressed in its enactment. So after this, elaborate rules of interpretations were evolved at a very early stage of Hindu civilizations and culture. This is the history of interpretations. The rules given by Jaimini, the author of Mamamsat Sutras, originally meant for Shrutis, to employ for the interpretation of Smritis also. Okay, the process of interpretations, several aids are used in the process. Okay, several aids are used by the judges. They may be statutory or non-statutory. The aids may be statutory or non-statutory. By statutory, it means the General Class Act 1895. Statutory aids may be illustrated by the General Class Act 1897, and by specific definitions contained in other individual acts, whereas non-statutory aids are illustrated by common law rules of interpretations. Common law rules of interpretation means the rules prevalent in English common law, which are, of course, customary rules mostly of unwritten nature, including certain presumptions relating to interpretations. Presumptions as well as included here, and also by case laws relating to the interpretation stated by case law here. It means precedents or just made laws relating to the interpretation of statutes. These are the 8. So we find 3 kinds of the 8. Number 1, statutory. Number 2, non-statutory. And number 3, case laws. Meaning and definition of interpretations. According to Salmond, interpretation or construction is the process by which the court seeks to ascertain the meaning of legislation through the medium of authoritative forms in which it is expressed. So, of course, the court wants to know the meaning of, know the intention of the legislature, but by what means? Through the medium of authoritative forms in which it is expressed. By authoritative forms here, it means the legislature, statutes or enactments in which it is expressed. The intention of the legislature is expressed and the enacted in the enactments or statutes. It may be expressed impliedly or expressly. It has been said that there is a distinction between the two expressions. Distinction means interpretation and construction. Both sounds quite similar, but there is distinction is also there. As expressed by Coley, interpretation differs from construction in the sense that the former is the art of finding out the true sense of any form of words, any form of, i.e. the sense that their author intended to convey. Construction, on the other hand, is a drawing of conclusions, respecting the subjects that lie beyond the direct expressions of the text. This distinction has been widely criticized. Okay, so this is according to Cooley, C-O-O-L-E-Y. You have to interpretation differs from, these lines are of course under the quotation. Interpretation differs from constructions in the sense that the former is the art of finding out the true sense of any form of words, i.e. the sense that their author intended to convey. Construction, on the other hand, is the drawing of conclusions respecting the subjects that lie beyond the direct expressions of the text. So construction has a wider meaning than those of interpretation, because interpretation simply means finding out the true sense of any form of words. Of course, it basically words, but construction, on the other hand, is the drawing of conclusions in respecting the subjects that lie beyond the direct expressions of the text. It is something which is beyond the mere words expressed. These narrations has been widely criticized. Of course, criticisms are also there. Interpretation of statutes is the process of ascertaining the true meaning of the words used in a statute when the language of the statute is clear. So, why the question of interpretation comes? Because when the language of the statute is clear, there is no need for the rules of interpretation. Rules of interpretation, that thing, 3 words. Rules of interpretation. Why it is so important? It is important in the case when there is the language of the statute is ambiguous. In that time, the court has to employ certain rules. Court or judges has to employ certain rules in order to interpret or ascertain the meaning or intentions of the legislature. Interpretation of statute is the process of ascertaining the true meaning of the words used in a statute. When the language of the statute is clear, there is no need for the rules of interpretation. But in certain cases, more than one meaning may be derived from the same word or sentence. More than one means, of course, a word mean more than it is therefore necessary to interpret the statute to find out the real intention of the statute. Interpretation of statute required for 2 basic reasons. Why it is required? Why it is important? For 2 basic reasons. Number 1, legislative language. Number 2, legislative intent. Number 1, legislative language. Legislative language may be complicated for a layman and hence may require interpretation. Legislative language may be complicated from a layman for a beginner, for a person who has who is not so layman means, and hence may require interpretations. And legislative intent, the intention of the legislature or legislative intent is similar to aspects. A, the concept of meaning, i.e. what the words mean, and B, the concept of purpose or object. First of all, it is meaning. Second is purpose and object, or the reason or spirit pervading through the statute. Some important points to be taken care of the context of interpretation with statutes. Number 1, intention of the legislator. Of course, intention of the legislator is important. It can be certain through various means or rules of interpretations. Number 2, statutes must be read as a whole in its context. As a whole, okay, not merely a simple or mere words, but the statutes must be read as a whole in order to ascertain its meaning, not only just a word or a sentence. Statutes should be construed so as to make it effective and workable. The construction, okay, this is not interpretation, this is constructions. It can be construed, means it can be concluded, so that as to make it effective and workable. so that its implementation becomes easy. If statutory provisions is ambiguous and capable of various constructions, then that construction must be adopted, which will give meaning and effect to the other provisions of the enactment rather than that which give none. Okay, so in case of golden rule, we have there are two kinds. There may be when the statute is ambiguous, incapable of ascertaining any kind of meanings, or when the statute gives two kinds of meanings, one may be sane and another absurd. So the golden rule is that they have to move forward the absurd. No, they have to move forward the sane rule, the meaning which is the meaning which is effective or workable, which is not opposed to public policy, or which may be effective in prevailing socio-economic conditions. If statutory provisions is ambiguous and capable of various constructions, then that construction must be adopted, which will give meaning and effect to the other provisions of the enactment rather than that which give none. None means nothing. It means if meaning is plain, effect must be given to it irrespective of consequences. If meaning is plain, effect must be given. Meaning is plain, it's not ambiguous. Effect must be given irrespective of consequences. It doesn't matter. The task of judiciary is interpretation of statutes. The task of legislative is making of the statutes. So judiciary cannot do what legislature is entrusted to do. If meaning is plain, effect must be given to its respective of consequences. The process of constructions combines both the literal and purposive approaches. Literal meaning is also important. In literal meaning is grammatical constructions. The purposive constructions rule highlights that you should shift from literal constructions when it leads to absurdity. Purposive means to purpose. Literal means to the grammatical rules. If the meaning is plain, it has to give effect to that meaning also. But purpose, what is the purpose of the legislators? Purposive constructions. Purposive rule highlights that you should shift from literal construction when it leads to absurdity. If literal construction leads to absurdity, then they have to shift from literal constructions to the purposive construction. Nature and scope. Necessity of interpretation would arise only when the language of a statutory provision is ambiguous, not clear, or where two views are possible. Nature and scope. Necessity of interpretation will arise only where the language of a statutory provision is ambiguous, not clear, or where two views are possible, or where the provision gives a different meaning, defeating the object of the statute. Okay, necessity of interpretation will arise in what cases? Only where the language of a statute provides ambiguous. Ambiguous means puzzling, not capable of giving meaning, not clear, unclear means, or where two views are possible, or where the provision gives a different meaning, defeating the object of the statute. When the provisions of the statute literal rules give a different meaning which is not in accordance with the object of the statute, defeating the object of the statute. If the language is clear and unambiguous, no need of interpretation will arise. In this regard, a constitutional bench of judges of the Supreme Court in R.S. Nayak versus A.R. Antulai has held. If the words of the statute are clear and unambiguous, it is the plainest duty of the court to give effect to the natural meaning of the words. Natural meaning means its literal constructions used in the provisions. The questions of construction arises only in the event of ambiguity, or the plain meaning of the words used in the statute will be self-defeating. Again, Supreme Court in Gramis Industries Ltd versus Collector of Custom, Bombay, has followed the same principles and observed where the words are clear and there is no obscurity, and there is no ambiguity, and the intention of the legislator is clearly conveyed. Words are clear, number 1. Number 2, there is no obscurity. Number 3, there is no ambiguity. And number 4, intention of the legislator is clearly conveyed. There is no scope for count to take upon itself the task of amending or altering the statutory provisions. The purpose of interpretation of statute is to help the judge to ascertain the intention of the legislators, not to control that intentions. Okay, there is two things to help the judges to ascertain the intention of the legislators. It is not to control that intentions or to confine it within the limits which the judge may deem reasonable or expedient. There is limitation, of course. They cannot control that intentions. They cannot do whatever they want or to confine it within the limits which the judge may deem reasonable or expedient. The correct is one that best harmonizes the words with the object of statute. As stated by your justice, to be literal in meaning is to see the skin and miss the soul. To be literal in meaning is to see the skin, okay, the outward form, and miss the soul. The judicial key of construction is the composite perceptions of the deha and the dehi of the provisions. According to Blackstone, the fairest and rational method for interpretation and interpreting a statute is by exploring the intention of the legislators through the most natural and probable signs, which are either the words, the context, the subject matter, the effect and consequences, or the spirit and reason of the law. So this is according to Blackstone, the fairest and rational method for fairest means just, and rational, logical method for interpreting a statute is by exploring the intention of legislators through most natural and probable signs, which are either in words, these signs which are capable of giving the intention of the legislator. These signs may be expressed either in words, the context, the subject matter, the effect and consequence, or the spirit and reason of the law. So after that, I'm going to discuss about the difference between interpretation and construction with comparison chart. Key differences. Difference between interpretation and construction. Interpretation and constructions. Okay. The statute is defined as the will or order of legislatures, which is expressly in the form of text. Statute is what? Will of the legislature, which is expressly in the form of text. The traditional way to interpret or construe a statute is to understand the intention of the legislatures. The intention of the legislatures will incorporate the actual meaning and object. The process of interpretation and construction is just a judicial body in determining the meaning and purpose of the legislative introduction. Of course, interpretation helps in determining the real meaning and intention of the legislature. So what is the difference between construction and interpretation? On the other hand, construction is used to ascertain the legal effect to the legal text. Ascertain what? Legal effect to the legal text. The two terms are used interchangeably, but their interchangeably means in the same sense, but there exists a fine line of difference between interpretations and constructions in their connotations. There exists a difference. So check out this. Okay. Then comparison chart. Basis for comparison. Meaning, first of all, meaning. What is the meaning of interpretation and what is the meaning of construction? Interpretation implies the identification of true sense of statute. Construction means drawing inference about the subject that are above the direct expression of text, that are above, or we can say beyond the direct expression of sense. It means drawing the conclusions. Interpretation determines what? Linguistic meaning. And construction determines legal effect. Linguistic meaning and legal effect both are different things. Linguistic meaning means only the grammatical, just linguistic, what the language implies. But construction is something more different from that of interpretations, in the sense that it draws out the conclusion. That's why it, of course, determines legal effect. Interpretation is used when court complies with simple meaning of the legal text, when there is no need of other rules of interpretations. And construction used when legal texts exhibit ambiguous. When the legal text means the linguistic, what here we see the linguistic meaning. The linguistic meanings exhibits ambiguous. Ambiguous means puzzling, incapable of giving any meaning, unclear, and the court has to decide whether the words used in the legal text converse the case or not. So these are only differences. Definition of interpretation. So we have already read here classification of interpretation: legal, doctrinal, legal, authentic, usual, doctrinal, grammatical, logical. Okay, so definition of construction. Okay, only this is conclusions. Right, when it comes to legal expositions of the statute actor, we don't need to read all this or everything, but just to remember, try to remember these four things. 3 actually, not 4. Meaning, interpretation implies the identification of the true sense of the statute. Construction means drawing inference about the subject what are above the direct expression of the text. Determines linguistic effect, determines legal effect. Yes, linguistic meaning. Used when court complies with simple meaning of the legal text. Used when legal text exhibits ambiguous meaning, and the court has to decide whether the words used in the legal text converse the case or not. This is the three points. Okay, thank you. Thanks for watching.